Good afternoon, everybody. Keep forgetting it's lunchtime. My name is Helen Carter. Yes, Deborah, you're in. I can see you. I work for Action Sustainability as the lead consultant on modern slavery, and we've developed this week-long series of webinars for you to really drive you through all the different aspects of modern slavery, due diligence and organisational response. So you're going to hear from the team. You'll hear in a moment from EJ, Emma Jane, who's going to look at policy, and tomorrow you'll see her looking at the enablers.
Well, Helen, we can't hear you very well. Just wiggle your microphone, maybe.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay. So you'll hear on Wednesday from Anna, who's our senior consultant. She'll be taking you through risk and supply chain mapping, and then you'll get myself, hopefully with a very good microphone, on Thursday and Friday. So our team is looking specifically at modern slavery in organisations and forced labour, and we've been working on this for a few years now. So EJ, you can go to the next screen. You'll see some of the organisations that we've been helping over the last 2 or 3 years. Looking specifically anything from training through to due diligence to risk assessment, number of those issues going forward. EJ, you can go through. Thank you. So as I said, we have 5 sessions that we're running, designed to take you through today being the sort of start of the journey, thinking about policy creation, taking you through how you set your organisation up, starting to prioritise and look at risk, and that lovely topic of supply chain mapping. So we start to really get to grips with some of the principles. And then Thursday, I'm going to talk to you about procurement and the role of supply chains and procurement. And then finally, we have a goldfish bowl exercise where we're going to hear real people, not goldfish, talking specifically about how modern slavery fits into those bigger issues of sustainability. So starting to bring it together from a corporate perspective. We've been part of the panel and the authorship of the new British standard, the BS 25700. So everything over the next 5 days is all information that will help you if you're looking to implement that standard. And in fact, we will inform you sort of throughout the week of training that we're going to be running in the new year, and in fact a new maturity matrix that we've been putting together to help businesses assess themselves against that standard as well. So today and the rest of the week is very much about really understanding those elements. So without further ado, you don't want to hear from me. I'm going to pass you over to EJ. I'm going to switch my camera off and I will come back in for the Q&A bit at the end. But I'm going to leave you in EJ's definitely capable hands, looking at policy and that going forward. Thanks, EJ.
Hello, morning everybody. Thanks for the intro there, Helen. Yes, I'm EJ.
I can't hear you.
Let's try without a mic, without earphones. How about that?
No, we're still struggling with sound.
Oh my goodness me. Right. How about that now?
Oh, okay, it's me. Everyone can hear you, EJ. I'll shut up.
Okay, I'm going to try and put my earphones on again. Sorry, because the quality will be better. So, okay, Billy, can you hear me okay now?
Sorry, I can hear you fine, EJ.
Perfect. Okay, look at that. Wobbly start. We'll be all right. We'll get there. Yeah, so nice to meet you all again. I'm EJ. I'm a consultant with Action Sustainability on modern slavery, human rights, bit of social value thrown in there as well. And I'm also the sector lead for the construction market within the supply chain sustainability school. Okay, so a little bit of housekeeping for today. We're going to read some interaction as we go through. So we're going to be using something called Menti. It's really simple. Just use your phone or your spare browser. We'll show you how to do that. So please do get involved in our Menti polls. If you have any questions as we go through, if you could use the Q&A function, that would be brilliant. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a bit that says Q&A. Click on that, and you can pop your questions in. We'll have time at the end of the session to look at some of your questions. If we don't get a chance to do them all, we'll try to respond afterwards by email. As always, we'd love to get your feedback. This is the first of the Modern Slavery webinars this week, so any feedback on what worked well, what we could do better, please do share it at the end via the feedback form, and we can take that on board for future sessions this week. And lastly, hopefully it's good news, we're recording this session and we'll share all the slides with you afterwards, so you don't have to make copious amounts of notes, so hopefully that's good news. So because this is, I suppose, the first webinar on modern slavery this week, I think it's important to make sure we're all really clear on the basics, just to make sure we're all clear on what we're talking about when we're talking about modern slavery. So a little bit of scene setting, looking at trends, drivers and so on before we get onto the kind of policy piece. Okay, so a definition here. So it's modern slavery is the illegal exploitation of people for personal or commercial gain, where victims are trapped in servitude, which they were deceived or coerced into and cannot leave. So when we're thinking about modern slavery, it's that piece around victims being trapped, which is really important. It's rarely a case where people are physically chained up and physically trapped, but it's where there's that sense of the victim feeling like they are not able to leave, no matter how much they want to, because of the way they're being threatened or controlled by their exploiters. So different elements.
Sorry, Jay, just to interject. Might be worth trying it without your headset. Just a couple of people saying that the sound is coming and going for them.
Okay, thanks for flagging that. Is that better?
That seems a lot better. It'll be loud at some points and then kind of goes quiet. Yeah.
Have a go. Headsets. We need new headsets, Helen. So within modern slavery, there's some different elements here. So you've got sexual exploitation. So this is when you're talking about things like forced prostitution or sexual abuse. The risk here isn't always where you would expect it to be. So for example, those of you who are familiar with the A14, the new road from Midlands to Felixstowe, I think, somewhere there on the east, they flagged modern slavery as a risk there because they had lots of workers who were predominantly male working on site and living in temporary accommodation. And the thinking was that gangs could bring in cleaners to service the accommodation, but then sell off the cleaners as prostitutes or sex workers. The thinking being, as an exploiter, you don't see these people as individuals, you see them as opportunities to get more money. So they're an asset. So as much money, they want to get as much money as they can from their assets, so to speak. Criminal exploitation. So this is things like when people are forced to do criminal activity. So forced begging, forced shoplifting, pickpocketing, they're forced to grow cannabis. And in the UK, there's a big issue there. I think it's about 25% of modern slavery victims in the UK comes from county lines. So the whole drug challenge with children in county lines. So what you tend to find is that where people are exploited, you often find individuals who've been forced to conduct theft or fraud, which makes them even more vulnerable. Then you've got forced labour there. This is where workers are forced to work for little or sometimes no pay. Victims are tricked, coerced into working and controlled by a whole range of means of things like threats to family, violence, isolation, people withholding their passports or impersonating positions of authority. And you'll hear more about this as we go through the week. So in terms, and lastly, domestic servitude there. So I think Mo Farah is the example that we've probably all heard of in the last year, where he kind of has shared his experience of being trafficked to the UK and being a victim of modern slavery and domestic servitude. So modern slavery in general, if you look at the stats there, the latest global estimates reveal that there's 49.6 million people. There were 49.6 million people in modern slavery on any given day in 2021. So what I'd like you to do now is just grab your phone, or if you've got a new browser that you can use, and go to menti.com, menti.com. And then once you're in there, I want you to pop in the code that appears on the screen. Don't disconnect from the webinar. I'm probably stating the obvious, but if you do, you'll lose us. I'm going to change my screen, but the code will still be on the new screen. Maybe, Billy, if you could just pop the code and the link into the chat as well, that would be helpful. So bear with me. Here we go. Oh, that's it. Lots of you are in there. Okay, so you can see the Menti code at the top still. And then I'm going to wait for a few more of you to join. Got 29 of you, 30 of you. Great. So that's all working out. I'll hang on a moment, then I've got a question for you. If anyone's struggling with Menti, just pop a note in the chat. That's it. There's still some of you joining. That's good. Okay, so I'm going to go into the question for you. Hold on a second. Okay. So of the 49.6 million people estimated to be in modern slavery, how many of these do we think were in forced labour? Is it 22.1 million, 27.6 million, 30 million, or 15.1 million? What do we think? Okay, sorry, some of you probably didn't get a chance to answer. There's a bit of a countdown there. Yes, the majority, well, 24 of you were right. It's 27.6 million, which represents about 55%. So thinking about that, I've got another question for you now. So next question. What do you think is the likelihood of there being modern slavery somewhere in your operations or in your supply chain? It'll be there, no doubt. Highly likely, likely, unlikely, or definitely not. I don't know why everything's blue on that. Oh, there we go. Let's solve that problem. Just going to hold on for you. Okay, so a few of you, some of you saying it's there, no doubt. Quite a few of you saying highly likely. But one or two kind of, and a few saying unlikely, definitely not. So what I'll say on that, I'll leave that open so we can see the results coming in, but it permeates pretty much everything we buy. It's prevalent in so many things, and we'll have a look at kind of sectors that are at risk, but everything from clothing, IT, lighting, just your phones, food and drink, construction materials, and so on. There's a, let me go back to my slide. 2 seconds, sorry. I can't talk and do things at the same time. There's a useful app that you can download called slaveryfootprint.org, and you can just use it to input all the things that you buy in your daily life, where you live, how you live your life, and it will give you an indication of the number of slaves they expect to be in the supply chain. So just thinking about your kind of personal life. I'd like to think that I'm quite careful when I buy things. You know, I look at certifications, not that they have all the answers, but I try to be as ethical as I can, and I have 50 slaves working for me, so to speak. So be aware of that. I would say for those of you who said it's very unlikely we don't have any, I would kind of, you know, probably need to have a think about that and have a proper look. These are some of the high risk areas. This is just to name a few. I mean, there are so many. In the UK, you've got car washes, nail bars, cleaning, anything like, especially in the UK, things around cleaning, facilities management as a whole. So catering, security, and so on. Flowers, they were in the news, I think it was last week, an issue where you've got issues in Kenya, where workers are in extreme exploitation of modern slavery for cut flowers. You've got bricks there, they're referred to as blood bricks. I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but they'll be discussed later, I'm sure, when we're talking about the procurement and risk mapping as well as one of the examples. You've got conflict minerals, everything, you know, think of all the tech in our phones and the lighting that contain cobalt and other conflict minerals. And then here are some more kind of common areas. So you've got PPE. You may have read about how the UK government being sued for links to PPE supplier during COVID that was accused of modern slavery in Malaysian glove factories. You've got the issues of sweatshops, all of the cotton, think about your workwear, uniforms, a lot in the news about that. I think we're a bit more familiar with the risks there. It's been in the news for longer, I think. And then you've got construction workers thinking about both in the UK, also overseas as well. Qatar World Cup, I think, is a light on that, looking at extreme exploitation and working conditions there. You've got fishing as well on there. There's lots of modern slavery and fishing and agriculture and so on. The reason, well, some of the reasons that these are high risk areas is where you have things like seasonal labour, where you have transient labour, where you have supply chains where the countries with poor human rights records, or they may have human rights legislation, but it's not enforced. But it's also thinking about where there is, you know, roles that are low skilled or low pay. And I can't remember if I said where there's that reliance on migrant workforce, but there'll be more about that tomorrow and throughout the rest of the week. But if you think there's no slavery in your supply chains or operations, just kind of think again. It's worth having a little think about that and a harder look. Okay, so in terms of legislation, in the UK, we've got the Modern Slavery Act, which came out in 2015. That requires businesses with a turnover of £36 million or above to produce a statement about what actions they've done, what they've taken to combat modern slavery in the last 12 months. More about that a bit later on. But the statement itself is about what you've done to combat modern slavery. So it applies to everybody. Just because you don't have a turnover of 36 million doesn't mean to say it doesn't apply to you, because trafficking and labour exploitation and slavery is illegal. So as it stands at the moment, protection of victims is at the heart of the legislation. However, sorry, not however yet, victims can't be prosecuted for any criminal offence that they may have been forced to commit. So it's very much about protecting and supporting the victims. However, I'm sure there'll be some of you in the room today who'll be thinking about the elephant in the room, so to speak, in that in October, the Home Office reclassified modern slavery as an immigration issue, with the claim that many people are gaming the modern slavery legislation in the UK to avoid being deported. The facts don't seem to stack up against this assertion, with, I think in 2021, a third of the potential victims of modern slavery that were going through the national referral mechanism were British nationals, clearly not linked to immigration issues. And in 2022, following investigations from the Home Office, 97% of those who claimed to be victims of modern slavery were found to be genuine. So it's just being aware of what's happening there and keeping an eye on what happens around the legislation. Oops. So there's a huge increase in due diligence legislation or legislative proposals all over the world. There's lots happening in Europe. I've just got some examples of those here, because I'm fairly confident in saying we used to think that the UK was quite a leader in this when we came out with the Modern Slavery Act. But there is a risk that we're falling behind a little bit now. What you're seeing is other countries and regions are moving away from just having that policy and statement to actually real actions, embargoes, goods being confiscated, a requirement to show what are you actually doing and examples of how you've done it. So just some examples here I've got to share with you. You've got the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act there on the bottom right. So this is in the USA. What they've done is they've banned products that have been produced or part manufactured in Xinjiang province in China. They're not allowed to go into the USA because of the prevalence of forced labour in that region for the Uyghur Muslims there. So nothing that's linked to those areas being part produced or manufactured is allowed to come into the US. The EU has also announced plans to ban products and imports made with forced labour. Clearly, it's not a simple piece of legislation. So yeah, there's lots of complexity. So do go and have a look. But think about the impact on our international supply chains. Yes, we're no longer in the EU, but we have international supply chains. In Germany, they've passed the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. That comes into effect, I think it's January next year, 2023. And that requires businesses with more than 3,000 employees. They're required to show what they're doing to identify, prevent and address human rights and environmental abuses with their own and direct supplier operations. And there's fines there. So they're saying you could be fined 2% of your turnover if you can't show how you're managing risk and analysing risk, what preventative remedial measures you're taking, what complaints processes you have in place. And then the top left one there, this is referred to as CSRD, so Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So it's new EU legislation that's big news that requires all large companies to publish regular reports on the impact of their activities on people, on the planet, and any sustainability risks that they're exposed to. So for the first time, there's this common reporting framework for non-financial data. You've got the Modern Slavery Act here as well, Norwegian Parliament. So there's a lot going on. These are just some examples. So in addition to those legislative drivers, there's also the big reputational risks. There's a much bigger lens on this now. And there's also more civil litigation. So you can see here on the bottom right, you've got BIFA. There's a report called Operation Fort that talks about what happened in the BIFA case, how BIFA was infiltrated. But they are suing the victims of trafficking in modern slavery, are suing BIFA. You've got here examples of Hyundai, Nike, Apple, BMW, Mars, Nestle, Hershey, the solar panels issue piling up at US borders that I talked about earlier on. UK government sued over forced labour imports from Xinjiang. Lots of examples there. I think in the news last week I saw IKEA allegedly using Belarus prisoners under forced labour conditions, where their prisoners are allegedly suffering from, they're undergoing torture, food and healthcare deprivation, and so on. So yes, there's a much bigger lens on this now. On top of that, you've got the investor piece, and ESG, so environmental, social governance, which is really driving this agenda. Investors are demanding much greater transparency from companies on their ESG practices. So modern slavery, along with other issues, is increasingly seen as a core sustainable business risk, and investors are using ESG data on this to inform investment decisions. Within some of, there's a PwC report here, and headlines within that said, I think it was 9 out of 10 asset managers believe that integrating ESG into their investment strategy will improve overall returns. So it's dispelling the myth around that potential conflict between financial and ESG performance. If you're struggling to get your head around ESG, there's a nice slide here that I've stolen from Slave Free Alliance and Hope for Justice. Looks at what the S means in ESG, how it links with modern slavery and the wider kind of human rights issues. If you're interested in understanding more about this, do join the roundtable webinar on Friday, which is where we're looking at the balanced approach to your sustainability commitments. Okay, I think we have a poll now. So moving on to thinking about policies. So I should have said to keep Menti open, so bear with me. I'm going to change my screen again. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next question for you. So you've got the code at the top of the screen, so hopefully you can see that still. And I want to know think about your own business. I'm interested to know what kind of policies you have. So do you have a standalone modern slavery policy? Or do you have an integrated approach where modern slavery is referenced in lots of other policies where modern slavery is relevant? So things like recruitment, EDI, training and development, right to work, I don't know, lots of different policies. Do you have a human rights policy, which includes modern slavery? Do you have a just transition policy? Or do you not have any policy or related policy that references modern slavery? Okay, so a few of you have got no modern slavery related policies. An equal balance, it looks, between those who've got a standalone modern slavery policy or integrated approach. Or it could be you have both. You may have a modern slavery policy and it's integrated within other policies within the business. Okay, that's interesting. So there's a small number of you, you've got the human rights policy. Okay, brilliant. Fantastic, thank you. You can carry on popping in your responses if you haven't finished, but let me just come back to my slides. Okay, so terminology. There's a little bit of confusion, I think, sometimes, and we tend to see policies called statements called policies, but more about that in a moment. But also, there's a little bit of confusion I tend to hear when we're speaking to clients or we're out and about, or stakeholders, of human rights and modern slavery. So I just want to make it really clear what we're talking about and what the difference is. So we talked about modern slavery, so we're clear on the definitions there. When we're talking about human rights, it's almost that umbrella category under which modern slavery sits. So human rights are the rights that belong to each and every single individual. There's no hierarchy of human rights. So all rights are equal. So it's things like right to freedom and equality, right to life, right to being protected by the law, right to privacy, and including right to freedom, so freedom from slavery. Rights are interdependent and, I could struggle with this, indivisible, that's the word, and interrelated. So if you have specific rights not being respected, a series of other rights won't be either. So if you lose your right to equality and right to protection by law, it increases your chance of being a victim of modern slavery. So just be aware of what the difference is. You've got human rights, which is the umbrella kind of category, and modern slavery, which is very specifically talks about that. So be aware of that. And then you've got, I think a few of you had just transition policies. So just transition, some people call it fair transition. There isn't one agreed formal definition of just transition, but the idea is about ensuring that the transition to net zero and development of a more sustainable economy is about providing opportunities for everybody. And that idea of leaving nobody behind and ensuring not having a negative impact on people. And also thinking about, if there have been negative impacts to date, what remediation can be brought into place, and things like, loss and damage fund that they've been talking about at COP. So the example of solar panels is really interesting, because solar panels are there as one of the solutions to help mitigate climate change. Yet there's a lot of forced labour in the polysilicon within solar panels. So that's an example of a real challenge around a just transition. So there tends to be, if we think about maturity on this, there's this changing landscape when we're talking about modern slavery, the policy landscape. So you've got kind of maturity kind of going downwards there. You've got people with a modern slavery policy, and then moving on to actually modern slavery, it's embedded in all relevant organisational policies, because it's not something that's set, it should be part of the way a business is and its operations. We'll look at that a bit later on. And then you've got the organisations who are kind of, a bit more mature. I think there's a few of you here today. They have a human rights policy that will include what they're doing around and their approach to modern slavery. And then you have those with the kind of just transition policy that looks at linking human rights and climate change. Okay, so just be aware of that kind of, that changing landscape. Policy and a statement. You hear so many people referring to a modern slavery policy when they mean their statement, or their statement when they mean their policy. So just to be really clear, the policy is the first thing you do. So it sets the direction of travel, the ambition. If you get the policy right and you have it backed up by implementation and a good strategy, the statement almost kind of writes itself, because it's the last thing you do. Under the Modern Slavery Act, your statement is the actions you've taken to combat modern slavery. Okay, so just bear in mind the difference between policy and a statement. So let's have a look at why develop a modern slavery policy. So just clearly there's other reasons here, but this is just some examples of the why. For those of you who haven't yet, I think there's a few of you who haven't developed a policy yet, so hopefully this will help you. The policy itself is almost like a mechanism to show that you understand your responsibility to combat modern slavery, and you're committed to doing that. So it's that way of just kind of clarifying, yep, we understand our responsibility, and this is our ambition and direction of travel. And it helps you demonstrate, yeah, you're a responsible business. It should also provide that kind of foundation, the essential building block for embedding the responsibility to combat modern slavery or human rights through all business functions. Modern slavery, sometimes hear people thinking about it as actually that's for the legal department, it's a compliance issue, it's not relevant to anyone else. That's the wrong approach, and as you'll find out throughout the week, enablers for combating modern slavery requires everybody within the business to understand what it is and their role in helping to combat modern slavery. There's something as well about demonstrating to stakeholders that you're taking your responsibility seriously and that you have a plan for combating modern slavery, which in turn will help you build trust. And if you think about stakeholders, who are your stakeholders? They could be your investors, your business partners, your customers, your workers, governments. And as we saw earlier on when we talked about investors, stakeholders are increasingly interested in this. Another thing that's helpful, or a reason why to develop a modern slavery policy, is it starts to help you identify policy gaps. So where should you be considering modern slavery that you aren't? So in the recruitment process, through procurement. Again, more about that later. But developing a policy is a really good opportunity to initiate a process that can alert the company to new areas of risk. And it's also, it's on the slide, it's a great opportunity to trigger the delivery of in-house learning, building capacity, building management capacity and leadership. So it can trigger that kind of training piece. So top tips when developing a policy. Again, I haven't mentioned it on there, but the first thing to bear in mind is don't expect perfection first time. A policy will evolve over time. You need to kind of remember that you need to be dynamic. It's not always a predictable process either. So it's not a static thing. You don't just have it and that's it. It's about revisiting it, and it should evolve over time. And your policy will be updated as you gain more experience, I suppose, in identifying and addressing and understanding your impacts there. It's absolutely crucial that it's driven by top management, senior management within the business. They need to demonstrate leadership and commitment here. Why? Going back to the idea that modern slavery isn't something that just sits with one department. It's the same as when we're talking about health and safety or sustainability. It's relevant to everyone in an organisation, and all parts of the business need to be aware of what it is and what their role is in managing the risks. Involving cross-functional employees. So some examples there: people from HR, procurement, supply chain, legal, compliance, business development. When you're developing a policy, the more roles you get involved, the more buy-in you'll get. So you'll create that common sense of purpose. Hopefully you get people enthused and understanding what their role is and why it's important. So that piece around almost empowering employees to understand their roles and responsibilities in addressing this within the business. Do engage stakeholders, both internal and external, understand their needs and their requirements, share knowledge. I've added in there about using experts. I think especially for smaller businesses who very unlikely will have an expert on modern slavery within the business. So there's lots of organisations out there that have got free resources, and you'll hear about some of them later on as we go through the week. There's also consultancies with in-house experts, but just be mindful that there isn't a kind of one-stop shop for one organisation that does everything. Different consultancies, different organisations will have their area of expertise in different areas, whether it's remediation or procurement or development policies and so on. So use experts, but be mindful there's lots of free resources out there as well. Really important to think about, I touched on this before, mapping or reviewing existing policies and procedures that you have. So, you know, look at your recruitment policy, your responsible sourcing policy if you have one, whistleblowing, procurement, right to work, codes of conduct. Think about related policies or procedures, and actually how does modern slavery slot into those. And then, of course, the piece around when you're creating a modern slavery policy, you need to accept that you can't tackle everything. You can't tackle everything. You can't completely eradicate modern slavery from your supply chains immediately. It's something to try and do one step at a time. You need to take a very much a risk-based and prioritised approach, and accept you can't do everything. Otherwise, you'll be setting yourself up to fail. It's such a huge challenge out there. It's prevalent in everything. So you need to take that prioritised and risk-based approach. Okay, so essential features of a modern slavery policy. So this is thinking about what's it got to have in, what's the kind of basic things it needs to have, and then we'll move on to look at what a good policy looks like. So essential things, they should state the intentions, the objectives and values of the organisation as agreed by top management, and it should link to existing values. So for example, you know, I'm sure most of you will have values that reflect a commitment against unethical behaviour. So it's linking to those existing values. It's about you need to ensure that the policy in its most basic form has a clear direction of travel. It's a statement of top management intention and direction, and a commitment to address the issue and manage the risk of modern slavery, and also satisfy any legal and regulatory requirements, both internally and within your own supply chain, so in your own operations and supply chain. Needs to be appropriate to the organisation. So this is the kind of, don't go down the copy and paste job. It's you can spot them a mile off. It has to be appropriate to the size, your sector, your operational environment. So if you're a recruitment company, your policy will look very different to a distribution company, if that makes sense. And at a basic level as well, you need to have that clear accountabilities and responsibilities in there. So that's the kind of what I would say are the essential features of a modern slavery policy. So I'm going to make you do some work actually. So going back to Menti, what types of things do you think should be included in a really good comprehensive modern slavery? So things that aren't necessarily, we didn't just talk about. What else should be in there? So I'm going to go back to Menti. Oh, maybe the answer's there. Right, so let's go to the next question. There you go. Just pop the words in and they should appear on the screen. KPIs, absolutely. How are you going to measure and report this? Where the risk lies for our company, yes. Clear language, absolutely. It's about being concise and clear. Commitment state from the business, yes. Brilliant, they're flying in now. Let me see if I can scroll down the screen. Due diligence, third-party suppliers, risk assessments, auditing, the main steps we will take to investigate and address. Clear responsibilities, absolutely. Who's doing what? Who's responsible? Planning for training, having the resource for training as well. Almost having budget to put towards this as well. Responsibility, compliance, communication and awareness. Yes, brilliant. Company commitment and support. I like that one there. Worded, brilliant. Yeah, worded so all employers understand their individual and specific responsibilities. And that we're going to talk about how we communicate all of this a bit very shortly. Training and awareness, whistleblower routes. How to manage it once an issue is found. Yes, that's the element that very often people kind of tend to forget. So keep those coming. We'll share those with everybody at the end of the session. I'm just going to go back to my slides. Okay, so you've got loads of those, well done. But just this is a list that I've got here that will help. Features of a good modern slavery policy. It's important to specify the scope and kind of boundary of your policy, so including any limitations or exclusions. Many of you talked about it's about identifying what your risks are, where the risks of modern slavery are, but also thinking about labour exploitation in your operations and supply chain and understanding where the hotspots are. Why exploitation? Because a big element of modern slavery due diligence is the prevention piece, and if you can identify where the risks of exploitation are, you can focus on reducing those risks. So ultimately, I suppose, reducing the risk of modern slavery. An example, if you're an events business, your modern slavery risks may be in the FM services of the venues you use for your events, so security, catering, cleaning, and so on. Whereas if you're a manufacturer of solar panels, one of the big risks will lie in where the polysilicon comes from. So think about that. We've talked, I think, quite a bit about links and relationships with other policies, recruitment, whistleblowing, sustainable procurement. A tip here, though, don't just think, oh, these are all my policies, I'll reference all of these and just shove in a big list of every policy or procedure you have in the business. Don't include your environmental policy or reference to it unless there's that direct reference to the idea around just transition and human rights and slavery going hand in hand. So only include where there is a clear link with modern slavery. Make sure there's a commitment to exercise and maintain a review of the risks. Risks change, they're not static. Every week I feel like there's an influx of new intelligence about risk areas, And it's about making sure you've got mechanisms in place that are referenced. We talk about this in the policy to assess, manage and respond to risk. A good policy should include references to any standards, guidelines, regulations or policies to be taken into account of. So things like, at its most basic level, the Modern Slavery Act. You may want to talk about things like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. We'll have a look at examples of this a bit later. Collaboration collaboration itself is absolutely key to tackling and combating modern slavery. It's not an area where organisations are looking to compete. We need to pool knowledge, share what we're doing, share what we've found and what we've discovered. So it's about thinking in your policy about referencing this commitment to collaborate, working with peers, stakeholder groups, and also partnership working as well. So thinking about if you're in the built environment sector, for example, I know many of you are today, it's about the Supply Chain Sustainability School. How can you collaborate through that initiative? Or if you're working with hospitality, are you involved in the Shiva Foundation? So collaboration is really important. You must, in a good policy as well, it will absolutely talk about how you tackle this in procurement and supply chain. Remediation, so this is a really interesting one. And this is where people there's a bit of a gap around really good practice on this. So it's about thinking about addressing whistleblowing or reporting, but also thinking how will victims be supported if they are identified, and what's the extent of the support offered. So in its simplest form, your remediation that you reference in your policy is about referring to the National Referral Mechanism if it's UK, but a more mature approach could be an organisation working with their peers to look at how they could support survivors of modern slavery. Again, more about that tomorrow. A good policy should link to a smart action plan, which would include training, supply chain engagement, remediation. I think some good ideas came up on that mentor poll a moment ago. And yes, absolutely, a good policy will have the objectives, KPIs, links to KPIs, measurement and reporting. A good policy has that link to the how. How are you going to deliver all of this? Smart objectives, your kind of racy matrix where you've got clearly assigned roles and accountabilities. There will be resource dedicated for this. And we'll hear all about this, I think, in tomorrow's webinar. Okay, so let's have a look at implementation. Yes, I talked about that. So a good policy will have a link to the implementation side of things. So let's have a look at some policies. Another elephant in the room, the second elephant I've mentioned, is that it's actually quite difficult to find really good standalone modern slavery policies. And what there tends to be is some really good modern slavery statements, but not the policies, or really good human rights policies. So I've got examples here of some human rights policies. But hopefully this will help you when thinking about modern slavery. So this is Marshalls. So Marshalls are a landscaping, building and roofing products company. So I like this because it's fairly succinct, fairly easy to read. You've got that clear statement of intent and direct travel at the top, and their values. They respect rights and seeks to uphold, preserve and promote these rights. They talk about accountability. So it's very clear here that Business and Human Rights Director is responsible and accountable. Talks about the scope and boundary here, so it talks about all of the issues covered under the human rights policy. And again, look at modern slavery, it's modern slavery, children's rights, training, stakeholder engagement, whistleblowing and so on. So it links to company values. There's a commitment there to collaborating as well. It doesn't talk about who they're collaborating with, there's that commitment there. And it links to risk assessment. And at the bottom here is that, and this is our risk assessment and our modern slavery statement. So you've got the links there. It talks about whistleblowing as well, so the grievance piece. And it talks about regular review as well. So as part of this process, our human rights policy is reviewed on an annual basis. So that's just one to have a look at. And then we can look at SSE. They talk about they have like a policy, they call it policy statement, but this is I suppose their initial statement. Yeah, it talks about its values. They talk about their responsibility for managing risk, There's that accountability and reference there to just one of many different related policies. I like the last sentence on the left-hand side there that says, and make SSE a sustainable company that people want to invest in, buy from, work for, and partner with. So it's that kind of that business case there as well. And then on the right, you've got the policy principles that talk about, their alignment to international standards, how they're addressing the risk and so on. On the next slide, it talks about roles and responsibilities. So it clarifies the scope here again. So it talks about all employees, workers, and people contracted to provide services through the company. And it makes it all management responsibility, not one department. Talks about governance there, really clear governance, steering group, a risk committee. And it talks about training, talks about speaking up, and the supporting documents here. Again, these are the ones that are relevant. There isn't just a huge list of loads of different policies and procedures. So you'll have the links to these when I send them through to you. And then have a look at this one. I've not gone into detail on this, but the Aviva one I like because their policy scope is really clear. It talks about their business units, operations, functions and staff, regardless of where they're based. It talks about their legal entities, joint ventures, outsourcing arrangements, new products, investments. There's really clear policy scope there. And the investment side here, our investment, it talks about how ESG factors have a material impact on investment returns, client outcomes, and how they're committed to integrating ESG issues, including modern slavery, into investment decisions and analysis. Communicating the policy, there's a difference between effective communication and just communicating. So it's about thinking about your audience, thinking about what do they need, meet differing needs of your stakeholders, different approach for communicating to internal teams, management, customers, supply chain partners and other stakeholders. So for example, a supply chain partner, your policy could be an appendix to a contract documentation that they need to acknowledge or sign with potentially links to training, but different approaches for different audiences. So think about who your audience are and what they need. And it could be that you need to communicate in different formats, different languages and so on. And invite people to share feedback as well. Have a feedback mechanism there. That's good practice. Don't communicate the policy just once and then forget it. It's about refresh, and it's about thinking, how do you know that the policy has been internalised by the recipients and not just acknowledged? Okay, so a little bit about the statement. So under the Modern Slavery Act, businesses with a £36 million turnover or above have to submit their statement. And to be honest, lots of clients are asking their supply chain, regardless of their turnover, to have a statement. So you've got the legal requirements here on the left-hand side. It must be approved by the board, visible on your website, and it must outline the actions taken to combat modern slavery. The issue we have at the moment is that if you haven't taken no action to combat modern slavery, and you say so in your statement, it's still legal. So it's a bit strange. However, this will be changing. The guidelines at the moment that are available on what a modern slavery statement should include here sectors of operation, where the risks are and how they're managed, any related policies, what due diligence you're doing, KPIs, what you're doing around grievance and remediation and training. They are going to become mandated soon. We don't know when, but the changes that will be coming soon are here. So the content of your statement will reflect what you just saw in those guidelines. Other key things to be aware of is your statements need to be uploaded to the Modern Slavery Statement Registry. Do have a look at that. Anybody can go in and you can have a look at what your competitors are doing, what your clients are doing, what your supply chain are doing. The Modern Slavery Statements are there to go and have a look at. So do go and have a look. We do have a webinar that we ran through the Supply Chain Sustainability School. I think it was, November last year. And it's the detail of, actually, it looks in detail at your modern slavery statement and how to upload it onto the registry itself. So that's a really detailed kind of step-by-step webinar that we'll signpost you to a link to after today. And here are some examples of modern slavery statements as well for you to go away and have a look at. You'll be able to click on them when you get the slide pack. Okay, so lots to take on board, I'm sure. Hopefully the links and the slides will help. But I think it's time for Q&A now. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open it up to Q&A. I'm going to have a look at the questions and the chat. That's great, Helen. You've got your camera on. Okay. Right, here we go. I've just seen stuff. Maria has said, based on your level of maturity, if modern slavery is captured in a human rights policy, surely that covers more and a modern slavery policy is not needed. Yes, you're right. So that kind of maturity piece that we looked at is organisations tend to start with a modern slavery policy, but the direction of travel seems to be going towards actually then not having a separate modern slavery policy, but having that human rights policy. But as long as modern slavery is adequately referenced and talked about in there, then you don't need to have that policy, but you do need your modern slavery statement to upload onto the, in line with the Modern Slavery Act 2015. Helen, I don't know if you had anything to add to that one.
Yeah, thanks, EJ. I agree. The only word of warning I would give everybody is if you decide to go down the route of the human rights policy, which is probably where this is going and emerging, is that you make sure that you've done what you need to address modern slavery. So what I've seen a lot with clients, they just create generic human rights policies that capture absolutely everything. And then when you actually get down to the nitty-gritty, they're not addressing modern slavery properly. They haven't thought about all those issues. So I would suggest that the human rights is the best place to get to. But once you've understood how due diligence applies and if it's consistent across modern slavery EDI, then go ahead. But there will be nuances of things that you need to do on modern slavery. So make sure you've thought about those before you rush straight for a human rights policy and then completely forget how to address the modern slavery piece. So that's where you want to get to. Make sure you don't take your eye off the ball around the modern slavery elements.
I see somebody asked about repeating the stat around ESG. I think it was from the PwC report. Yeah, so it was, I don't know how big the sample size was, but I'm sure that will be there in the PwC report. But it was 9 out of 10 asset managers believe that integrating ESG into their investment strategy will ultimately improve overall returns. So it was, I think the point I made was it's about dispelling the myth that there's a conflict between financial and ESG performance. It's actually, they just go hand in hand. And again, it's thinking about if you're a responsible business and a sustainable business, you tend to be a more profitable business who retains its staff, looks after its people, looks after its workers, and so on. A question here from Deborah. So I'd like to know whether upholding good quality education for all children, including girls, is the best way for governments and communities to combat modern slavery in this country and the world at large. Why not? Helen, I'm going to go to you. My voice is dying. I'm going to go to you first.
EJ, through the presentation, talked about prevention and vulnerabilities. So one of the things that you need to think about when you're thinking about how to address modern slavery, and we'll explore this more and more during the week, is to avoid this concept of compliance and tick box exercising. So prevention is about eliminating vulnerability. So good quality education for girls, bearing in mind that girls make up a very large percentage of modern slavery victims, is definitely a plus. We're seeing this in areas where the construction sector, the Gang Master Labour Abuse Authority has done some great work on educating apprentices on their workers' rights. So this is not about a modern slavery checklist. It's about understanding the vulnerability that causes an individual to be susceptible to exploitation and addressing that. So education and educating individuals who are vulnerable is definitely a good scenario. And I think EJ did a great job of explaining to you the interdependencies. So well-being, training, equality and diversity. These are all also tools that you can use when you're starting to think about how you treat people and how you remove those vulnerabilities. So the answer is yes, Deborah, it is part of that solution, definitely in the prevention mode as well.
Okay, thanks, Helen. Seen a question from Dylan. So we mentioned that when Modern Slavery Act first came in, the UK was seen as a forerunner, whereas now we're falling behind. What more do you think we need to do in the UK? What can we learn from other countries? And what do you think we need regarding regarding further legislative change. At the moment, as we talked about, the Modern Slavery Act quite simply requires organisations to submit their statement, but if they've taken no actions to combat modern slavery, so what? There's nothing there at the moment. So the first step is actually the government amendments coming into play, which oblige organisations to have, to incorporate, remember the guidelines that said it needs to talk about risk, what you're doing about agreements and remediation. That's the first step. But then I would suggest, if you look at what Europe are doing, what's happening in the USA, essentially for different drivers there, different, countries doing things for different reasons. But they're starting to, look at embargoes. They're starting to really take due diligence seriously. They're starting to impose penalties. So I would say it's seeing what happens overseas as well. But what we don't want to do is end up with all the stuff full of forced labour that's coming into this country because it's piling up on the borders of the EU and places like Canada or USA, where they've said, no, we're not accepting this because it's coming from Xinjiang area of China, likely to have forced labour. We don't want all of those products suddenly kind of, coming on our markets here and saturating our markets. Yeah, so Helen, I'm sure you've got some thoughts on that.
Sorry, that was just a coffee, Jay. I wasn't meaning to interrupt. Yeah, I think you're spot on. It is about moving legislation to due diligence, to place the onus on businesses to do effective and proper due diligence. And we'll obviously cover that over the next few days in terms of what that could look like. But interestingly, and there was a question in the chat that I know hasn't been put into the Q&A about, the EU legislation is for EU and Brexit means we're not part of that anymore. One of the things to understand is no matter what people seem to think, we aren't an island really. We may be surrounded by sea, but we have links trades globally and still into Europe. So the European legislation, for example, will still apply for goods coming into Europe. So we will still need evidence of this. Plus, we're talking to clients at the moment that are owned by European businesses. So head offices are sitting in Germany or sitting in France or sitting in some of those regions. And what we're seeing is they want to take a harmonised approach, so they're forcing the UK divisions to comply with the same pieces of legislation and getting themselves ready. And the last I heard, I did hear that the UK government was not necessarily thinking of putting due diligence legislation in place, although there's pressure to do that, but they were thinking about the procurement regulation reform. Of having something in there about forced labour, particularly with Xinjiang, which means that we do know that government contracts will be pulled if there are issues of this arising. So we may not have the best legislation anymore. We definitely don't, but we are impacted now by that increase, and I think we probably will end up seeing some changes. But the amendments is a good place to start. The amendment bill that's going through Parliament at the moment is still at very early stages, but there's even requirements for a private members bill being discussed on ensuring that businesses fully transparently report and could be actually subjected to criminal charges if they don't. But that's in very early stages. So getting the changes as requested is a good place.
I've just discovered in the chat there's loads of questions. So there's one there that I'll pick out, but and we'll touch on it tomorrow actually. Somebody said, regarding due diligence, would you recommend supplier modern slavery questions a part of a wider supplier audit, or should it be standalone due diligence? I would say supplier modern slavery questions. Oh, sorry. Okay, I completely misunderstood that. I thought you were talking about supplier questionnaires. Sorry, let me read that again. Wider supplier audit. So I suppose that when you say audits, something you need to be aware of with audits is they don't provide all the answers, especially when you're talking about international supply chains. That's an absolute nightmare. You've all heard the stories of the music changing in a factory and suddenly all the people who are being exploited disappear and everything suddenly looks okay. And then in the UK, I would say if you're going down the auditing route, the things that you could be doing is having audits where you're asking your workers, say if you're in construction, asking your site workers, doing spot checks on them, asking if they understand what their rights are, do they have contracts, have they had any deductions to their pay, Are they getting the minimum wage, and are they in control of their bank accounts? I would say those are kind of practical things to think about in terms of the auditing side of things. Helen, anything to add on that? I'll be covering that a lot more detail tomorrow.
And I'll cover that on Thursday as well in terms of the arsenal of tools through procurement. So we'll talk. I mean, the reality is, shouldn't be squished into just a compliance audit. The worker voice is definitely important, and they're all different types of audits. So I'll go through those on Thursday through the procurement stuff.
So I'm aware it's 1 o'clock, so I would think it's probably, I can see there are more questions in the chat, so we'll get back to you. Any questions that we haven't covered, we'll summarise those and send it out with the slides and feedback. So let me just go back to my slides.